without further ado, I do want to invite Abraham, our first lecture, to lecture about the why should you do a pen test. So Abraham, if you want to share your screen.
Can you see the screen?
Yes, we can.
Cool. So, okay. So thank you everybody for coming. So today we'll see why you should do a manual pen test. We don't have much time, so I'll fly through some of the slides. So Leo already went through this, so there's no need to spend any more time. But let's say I was a developer first, and then I switched to security. So if you are a developer or you are a pen tester, I got your back, right? So I know it has to be working in production on Friday for developers, and I know why are you not fixing my vulnerabilities, frustration from security professionals, right? So we'll talk more about public Pentest reports, but just to say, go to 7Asecurity.com publications, you can download a lot of public Pentest reports and you just click and you get the PDF and you can, this is just a fast way to learn about security without paying anything, right? And also, like, for example, if you have like an Android app or an iOS app, you can look at public Pentest reports from security companies and see, well, what kind of security problems are companies finding on Android, iOS, or websites or whatever else, right? So depending on what you're interested in, you can see here, this has like web components, cloud components, mobile components, right? So it depends on what you're interested in, but you can see, what other companies are finding. And there's like a bunch of other pen test reports. So let's just jump to the topic, right? 14 reasons why you need a manual pen test, right? So many people, especially CEOs, believe that automated security tools can completely protect software, right? So this benefits two people, mainly the vendors who can sell ineffective products and services that report that they can find all the vulnerabilities, right? And cyber criminals to exploit these issues for fun and profit, right? So, but any security professional will tell you because they know, right? So everybody that has like any experience in security will tell you, like all automated tools have false positives and false negatives, right? So what is the problem with false positives? False positives are basically fake issues, so they waste your time and money, right? So this is the same problem with bug bounties, right? Like you get a lot of fake submissions, and then you have to pay someone that is going through all these fake results, and this takes a lot of time, right? And people don't factor in when they, for example, set up a bug bounty or when they buy an automated tool to find security problems, they don't factor in the time that is going to take to go through the false positives because you have to pay people to go through these findings, right? And then the other problem is the false negatives, right? When the tool misses like a security problem that is there, but the tool cannot find it, right? So let's see why it happens, right? But first of all, let's explain something, right? If automation was really enough, why do large companies like Google, Facebook, and many others use the following on top of automation, right? So they use a lot of automated tools, they do fuzzing, everything else, but they also have huge in-house security teams. On top of that, they also hire pen tests performed by external companies. And on top of that, they implement bug bounty programs on top of everything else, right? So automation can help. You should definitely use it. I'm not saying you shouldn't. But it is not sufficient, right? So every automated solution you try will not be perfect because there's certain security problems that tools cannot find. So I'm just going to show you the reasons why, right? So one case for this is when vulnerabilities high in complexity, all right? So sometimes dynamic analysis tools will completely fail to reach vulnerable endpoints. Like, for example, the date is only valid if the user is more than 18 years old and the automated tool doesn't enter the valid date, so it will never test the endpoint that is like processing this afterwards. So if you cannot reach the endpoint or call it correctly, to reach the vulnerability, you will not be able to find the vulnerability because you are just not reaching the endpoint, right? Or the same way, like invalid parameter or a parameter combination. So Spanish postcode for a UK address is never going to work, and then you don't reach the vulnerable code. When there's a required multi-step sequence prior to the vulnerable endpoint, right? Like you need to call like certain things in combination. Automated tools have a lot of trouble with this, whereas a human will understand it and be able to do it, right? Or the tool fails to detect if the user is logged out. So you're logged out, so everything else you try never reaches the endpoint because you're basically logged out, right? These are just some scenarios where this tends to happen, right? And then what happens with static analysis tools, right? So they also fare poorly when frameworks and app generate code on the fly, right? So especially smart developers tend to do this because, of course, you write less code if you write code that writes code, right? So dynamically generated code will likely be completely missed by static analysis tools, right? So these are some of the shortcomings of automated tools, and this is why you also need a layer of manual testing, right? Another example is logic flaws, right? So logic flaws are pretty much impossible to find for both static and dynamic analysis tools because they are a flaw in the logic, right? So this is going to depend on the business, and this is going to vary depending on the application. So you cannot really automate this very well. And here you have an example from a guy that got a 10,000 bounty for Facebook because he found a logic flaw, right? So this is all like documented in the slides. So I'm just going to fly through this because there's a lot of slides, but just to show, example for each thing. Another example is information disclosure, right? So if an automated tool is testing for XSS, it will send some XSS payload, and then it sees that in the response, the XSS didn't work, and it moves on. But it doesn't realize maybe that you sent the XSS, but you actually can see data that you shouldn't be able to see, right? Whereas a human will be able to see that. It will say, hey, this looks funny, even though I was trying XSS, I'm actually seeing some funny output from the server, so I'm going to investigate, and then you find, like, maybe you can see data for other users that you shouldn't be able to see, right? So this is an example of, being able to read random server memory, uploading a crafted GIF image, for example, right? Another vulnerability found on Facebook by another bug hunter, right? So just another example of that, right? Missed by a very big company like Facebook. Now, another example is, should user A really be able to see or access something, right? So humans can answer that, but tools really can't. You can have a human configure the tool to kind of be able to do it up to a point, but it's really going to be a human that will realize this, right? So in this case, you have another Facebook bug, $27,000. He found that you can add yourself as an admin to any business, and then you take over any business account, right? So just an example of an authorization flaw that was kind of a little bit tricky with a little bit of logic, and every tool is going to miss this, right? So this is why you need a manual printer, because these types of bugs would never be found by automated tools. Now, even more important is business logic errors, right? So the business logic, this is, super tricky to test, and this is going to vary depending on the business. And automated tools will completely fail at stuff like that, right? So, for example, if you buy with a negative price, like, will you get a refund, right? Things like that, right? So this is like an example of a bug in Shopify related to this. Then there's Apple injection attacks, right? So now injection attacks, normally automated tools will be somewhat good at finding them, but there's cases where they will fail, right? Or especially like if there's some sort of dynamic code generation going on, even static analysis tools will sometimes have trouble with this. So you have here an example of a vulnerability found by Franz Rosen on SEMrush with this, right? This was a remote code execution through a logo upload, which was a type of an injection attack that he managed to find, like this. Now, API implementation flaws are another example where trial and error is often required, especially to reach all the endpoints. So when we have a pen test and there's like an API component, we always ask, hey, do you have like a Postman, Open API, Swagger, or something similar, so that we assure we are testing all the API endpoints you have, right? Because if you cannot call the endpoints, or you fail to call some of the endpoints, you will not find the vulnerability, right? And tools are really bad at this, right? Because sometimes you You have to do like a sequence that I mentioned before, like call several API endpoints in sequence. And if you don't use the right sequence or the right parameters or something else, then you fail to call the API, so you will not find the flaw, right? Another example would be remote code execution vulnerabilities. So sometimes even automated tools will find some remote code execution vulnerabilities, right? So this is an example of that. And then low-level vulnerabilities, right? So sometimes the vulnerability is not like in the code itself, but is like in the way it's compiled. There's like some small difference that then leads to a security problem, right? You can have vulnerabilities in processors, in compilers, subtle interactions between the libraries you use, right? So all these stuff takes a lot of time to test, but sometimes can lead to really crazy vulnerabilities that you would like never find, right? Otherwise, unless you test like the whole thing, right? Then in secure direct object references, this is kind of a very technically easy attack to perform, right? It's an attack that your grandmother can do. You go to the URL bar and you change a number, and then you can see the data for another user. But the impact is really high, right? Because when you're looking at security, you look at the impact, but also like the difficulty to exploit, right? So if the difficulty to exploit is very low, like your grandmother can do it, and the impact is really high, you can see other people's data, then this is really bad, right? Even though from a technical perspective, it's an easy vulnerability. Then another beauty of IDOR or insecure direct object references is that no web application firewall will save you from this, right? Because no automated tool knows that one is good and two is an attack, right? Because it's just like a number changing. So web application firewalls will be really bad at this, right? So this is also another reason why you need a manual pen test, right? Then with XSS, sometimes this is tricky to find, right? Especially DOM XSS is very tricky when you have like a lot of JavaScript code on your website and there's like a lot of string concatenations going on. Sometimes very big companies have struggled, especially with DOM-based XSS. Now, other types of XSS companies are now getting better at, but especially DOM-based XSS still comes up a lot, right? Then server-side request forgery, it was previously considered like a vulnerability, like not very scary, but nowadays with the cloud, right, with SSRF, if you can read the AWS tokens, now the server is no longer your server, is the attacker server, right? So SSRF can get really bad, and this is like another example of an SSRF in PayPal, and it was pretty bad because the guy got 10K, right? So just an example of that. Sometimes there's also memory corruption vulnerabilities. And then another thing not to overlook is when you chain multiple vulnerabilities, right? So sometimes maybe you have 20 vulnerabilities with a low severity, but if you combine them together in a clever way, you can increase the impact dramatically, right? So sometimes there's companies that say, well, I'm only going to fix the issues that have a CVSS score of 7 or greater. And if it's lower than that, then I'm not going to fix them because they are not serious enough, right? So there's a lot of companies that do stuff like this, right? If it is not ranked high, then I'm not going to fix it. Now, of course, you have to prioritize, and there's a time and a place for this, but you shouldn't overlook the fact that sometimes people can chain, like multiple low severity vulnerabilities to increase impact, right? So, and only a human will be able to do this, right? Tools are still not clever enough to think like, oh, if I chain this and this and this and this, then I can actually do a lot of damage, right? In this scenario. So those are the 14 reasons why you should do a manual pen test. And now let's talk a little bit about the shortcomings of automation, bug bounties, and cheap quote unquote pen tests, right? So automated tools have a limited understanding of context, right? So they cannot interpret the contextual nuances. So they often misinterpret what is a vulnerability and what is not because of that, right? They don't have the context of the business, the context of the logic, right? Automated tools are unable to mimic human intuition. Maybe this will change with AI. So far, we are not there yet. So there's a lack of intuition and critical thinking compared to human testers, right? So what I mentioned before, you call an endpoint, you see something you shouldn't be able to see, and then, the human will see it, whereas the tool was testing XSS, didn't find XSS, and moves on, right? And then automated tools struggle with novel threats, right? So they rely on predefined patterns. So they have like a database of types of vulnerabilities, and they are unable to find emerging or custom and catalog threats, right? So things that are kind of weird behavior, they are not really good at finding, right? Now, they also overlook system-specific configurations. They are unable to adapt to unique setups, and they miss vulnerabilities specific to an organization or an app, right? So this has happened to us in Pentest, like we report something as medium, and then customer tells us, no, this is actually critical because you should never be able to see that, right? So this is like business-specific stuff that, and you only get this type of feedback when you talk to a customer, right? And then sometimes they are ineffective in complex environments because they are unable to navigate intricate systems, and then you get the false positives and false negatives. Then with bug bounty programs, you have like a huge influx of invalid and fake submissions, so you have to pay people to go through these submissions. Then you have an elevated workload for the development teams that have to go through this, and then you have an increased resource allocation for review and verification of all this stuff, right? So you have to factor in the time it's going to take to go through all the fake submissions, right? So yes, you will get some good submissions, but you will also get a lot of people submitting fake findings, and you have to pay some people to go through all that, right? So this can be tricky, right? So bug bounties are not perfect by any means. And then you have a reduced efficiency due to a high nose to signal ratio, right? So if you have lots of bullshit submissions, uh, compared to few and useful valid reports, then the valuable report get buried in the noise and can be missed, right? Because if you have like 200 submissions and two are good, the odds of missing the good ones is really high, right? So this can escalate the costs and so on, right? So this is some of a very typical problem with bug bounties, right? So now some people call penetration tests things that are not penetration tests. So when you see like a cheap penetration test, you should be suspicious. And you also have to think about it this way, right? If you were going to have heart surgery, would you choose the cheapest surgeon, or would you choose the best surgeon you can find? What would you do, right? Just think about it, right? So, okay. So what happens if you buy a cheap pen test, right? You're going to get companies that copy paste the output of an automated tool and they call that a pen test. So this is not a pen test. Now you have the false positives and the false negatives that we talked about at the beginning, right? So you're going to waste time with the false positives. With the false negatives, you're going to miss vulnerabilities. They will use often less skilled professionals, right? To make the pen test cheap, you have to pay less to people doing the test. So you either copy and paste the result of an automated tool, or you put like someone that doesn't have a lot of experience and you have to pay this person less money as opposed to a high profile professional, right? So this is going to increase the business risk, right? Because a cheap pen test means low hanging fruit vulnerabilities, and then you can have loss of customer trust and brand damage. Especially we see this a lot when sometimes we get a request for a pen test when some client has entered something on a screen and seen something they shouldn't be able to see, and then they get pissed off about this, and then they complain, right? And then the company says, okay, we really need to test the security of this because this cannot happen again, right? And then you can also have regulatory penalties, and you will likely get hacked, right? If you do that, right? So just to say that, okay. So okay, let's just simplify, right? So let's show a case study. Show me the data. Why should I do a pen test, right? So this is from one of our customers, right? Just to simplify, I'm only mentioning here the directly exploitable vulnerabilities, which is the part of the report with the like most important findings. So the first time we pen tested them, we found one medium issue, one low, and one high, right? So this is what we found. Then there were some hardening stuff, but this was like the most serious, right? So 3 directly exploitable vulnerabilities on the first pen test. Second pen test, we only found 2 directly exploitable vulnerabilities, one of which was passed before we gave them the final report because we report like high and critical things during the test. So they fixed this before. And then on the third pen test, we found 0 directly exploitable vulnerabilities. So identified vulnerabilities, none, right? So this was an excellent result, which shows you that the more pen tests you do, the more the test team is going to struggle to find something. In fact, if you talk to any pen tester and you ask them, hey, what's your experience after you pen test an application 4 or 5 times, assuming the company that you do the pen test for patches what you find, right? Because sometimes they don't patch, and that's different, right? If they don't patch, you just copy and paste the results from the previous pen test. But if they patch things, if they take it seriously, then it will be extremely difficult to find anything. The testing will struggle to find anything worth putting in the report. And this is like an excellent result, right? 0 directly exploitable vulnerabilities on the 3rd iteration for this customer who was very diligent in patching everything we put in the report, right? So this shows you why you need a manual pen test, because the security of whatever you have, mobile application, web application, whatever, is going to get better, right? So a quick iteration summary: first pen test iteration, 3 directly exploitable vulnerabilities; second, 2; third, 0 directly exploitable vulnerabilities. So is regular penetration testing valuable? Any pen tester will tell you 100% yes. It will become increasingly hard to find anything in an app that is regularly pen tested and patched, right? If it is patched every time it is tested, right? If they don't patch, of course, the pen test is not going to do anything. But if they patch everything that you report, it will be really, really difficult to find anything, right? So some final thoughts. You have to factor in the real cost, right? So affordable pen tests rely on automated tools and miss high and critical issues. The real test cost includes consequences from missed vulnerabilities, so the false negatives that I talked about, and then the false alarms, which are the false positives, which lead to lots of wasted effort of people you pay that have to go through these fake findings, which are completely fake. So this is a completely waste of time to pay someone to review fake findings, right? So this is what you get when you get a manual pen test report. You get like real vulnerabilities. Your team doesn't waste any time reviewing bullshit findings and vulnerabilities, right? So skill testers will provide you with adequate insights, true findings, and prioritize remediation efforts effectively, right? So the pentest company should also tell you like what is most important to address and so on, right? So comprehensive tests are going to drive proactive security strategies that work, and investing in quality audits will improve the defense and ensure resilient operations, right? So manual testing is vital for uncovering complex vulnerabilities missed by automation, as I explained before. And automation complements, but does not replace expert security audits, right? So this is the bottom line, right? So you really should use automation as much as you can. I'm not saying you shouldn't, but you should also do expert security audits, right? So hire some company. So with that, we have, I believe, some time for questions. There's a few discounts there. We are also doing a free pen test contest this year, right? So you can click on that. I think you will make the slides available, right, Lior, for everybody?
Yes, of course. We will publish all the recordings. There were several questions. We are recording the sessions, and everything will be uploaded to our LinkedIn page. So everything will be out there. We will also share in the chat the coupons and links to the 7Asecurity. So no problem. Everything will be published, of course.
Cool. So yeah, so we're doing a free pen test contest, right? So you can get a pen test completely for free, right? So that's the contest there in the blog. Then there's a $100 off for your next pen test, right? Here there's no luck component. This is like for everybody. And then you have this Meetup 40 discount that you can use to get like 40% off any 7Security course, right? So yeah, so with that, I believe we have about 5 minutes for questions or so.
Yes. Guys, if you have any questions to Abraham, please write them down in the Q&A. He will be able to answer all your questions. And as you see, Abraham will send you this coupon, and you will be able to use it and do a free pen test on your company or on your site. How does it go? Just a free pen test?
Yeah, let me see if I can.
Guys, it's for free. Use it. Why not? Use it, guys. I have Abraham one question that I was wondering. When you are doing a pen test on different environments, meaning cloud environments vs on-prem, are there any differences from penetration test point of view on how you are reporting it, what you are doing, which kind of an exploit you are performing?
You're asking from an external versus an internal pen test? Well, yeah.
Everything, yes, everything is external. However, when environments are different. So when you are doing a pen test on cloud, is it the same as you are doing an on-prem, or what are the differences from your point of view?
Well, normally in our reports, right, the way we classify things is directly exploitable would mean like the level of access required to exploit is relatively low. So you either have a low privileged user that can become admin or something, or something like that, right? So like most, either a user can exploit it or somebody without authentication can exploit it. Normally, for cloud stuff, we file almost everything normally as a hardening recommendation because you need some access to the infrastructure first, right? So that level of access, we consider it to be relatively high. So we will report it as a hardening recommendation, but that doesn't mean that you shouldn't fix it, right? So you still should fix it, of course. But cloud findings are normally stuff like you have a Docker image, and this Docker image has like certain tokens that shouldn't be there. And if somebody has access to the Docker image and uses these tokens, then with these tokens, you can access other stuff in the infrastructure that you shouldn't. So you're actually bypassing the intended restrictions of the infrastructure, right? Or with Kubernetes, for example, doesn't implement network isolation by default. So with Kubernetes, what we find is that because they have this flat network by default, normally customers don't change this. And then what happens is like sometimes with Kubernetes access to some stuff, some of the pods, you can access other pods and then do some damage that way. So you can have a user that has relatively little access, but they can escalate inside of the infrastructure and do some damage, right? Like access, like much greater privilege stuff, even sometimes get like full like Kubernetes, like admin or something like that, just by stealing credentials in environment variables or something else, right? Or in the memory of some image that is like stored at rest and not encrypted, things like that, right? So normally cloud audits look for that type of stuff. Like if I have access to X, can I access Y? Then I shouldn't, right? So yeah, in that sense, it's very different from traditional like web or mobile issues where you actually like either have the mobile app or the web app and you just attack it, right?
Okay, that's interesting because the landscape actually enlarges when you're uploading your code or your infrastructures to the cloud. So you have additional things that need to take into consideration from security point of view. So we have several questions. Asaf is asking, any recommendations on a platform for building up pen testing capacities?
Well, I mean, an excellent reason. It depends on what type of pen testing, right? So I'm sorry to say the answer is always it depends. But so if you want to improve your mobile pen testing capabilities, then OWASP has an excellent project, which is the OWASP Mobile Testing Guide. If you are trying to improve your pen test capabilities in terms of web security, OWASP has the OWASP Testing Guide. I always favor the testing guides from OWASP and the application security standards from OWASP as opposed to the top 10. The top 10 is an excellent like starting point, don't get me wrong, but the testing guides is really what is showing you like all the tests that you should do. And the application security standards from OWASP is what tells you like the most important stuff to look for and stuff like that. Then OWASP also has like a code review project guide, which is also really good. And then from a defense perspective, there's the OWASP Top 10 proactive controls. So this is the must send to every developer, right? So if you are a pen tester, you can either add that as a recommendation in your reports, right? If you have a finding where a certain OWASP Top 10 proactive control will help, or if you are an in-house pen tester trying to educate developers, you can also like point them to the OWASP Top 10 proactive controls. There's OWASP Top 10 proactive controls for web stuff and for mobile stuff, right? As far as I know. So those are extremely good to improve all that.
Mhm.
So yeah,
And I
those are
can,
some pointers, right?
yes, that's good. And on top of that, you can also go to the 7Asecurity website and see all the training. You will get more knowledge and understanding and tools, and being more educated. So there are training in the 7Asecurity with 40% discount. It will be a good opportunity to learn from the expert, from Abraham and his team, of course. There is additional questions coming from Peter. He's asking, is web pentest and mobile pentest uses different techniques?
Completely different techniques. There's some like small overlap, right? So normally the biggest overlap is the mobile API, right? So every mobile application will almost always have some web API that it calls. So that part is going to be very similar to web pen testing, right? But you have to man in the middle, the mobile app, to see how the API requests look like. So that part will be very similar to web testing because it's basically, like a web API. But all the client attacks on the mobile applications, they are very specific, right? So on the mobile environment, for example, you have to bear in mind that the URL bar is not going to be displayed most of the time because the screen is very small on the mobile device. So phishing attacks can have a great impact as opposed to on the normal web environment. So sometimes even if you only have HTML injection and you don't have like full-blown XSS, but you can craft a believable login page, you can actually get like an extremely great phishing attack against a mobile application user as opposed to a web user, right? Just because the URL bar is normally not displayed. And then, yeah, in our mobile course, we cover a lot of examples. Like sometimes you have like XSS on mobile apps, and with the XSS, sometimes you can exfiltrate files from the file system of the app and send them to an attacker. Sometimes you can also have SQL injection in mobile apps, but a lot of other attacks, like for example, tax hijacking, are like very, very specific to mobile apps, right? So where you have like a malicious mobile app on the device that can like invoke your app or mess with the task manager in Android so that if the user tries to open your app, they are really opening the attacker app. And if the attacker app shows a screen that is completely indistinguishable from the victim app, then you have like an extremely great phishing attack. And a lot of banking Trojans have used this technique, for example, right? So I would say, yeah, it's very different, but there's some overlap, especially with the mobile API.
Okay, that's good example and very good point. One last questions. If you need to recommend a company to choose a penetration tester or a pen test company, what would you recommend them to check before choosing a pen test company?
Well, one thing to check is if they have public Pentest reports, because if they have public Pentest reports, you can read the public Pentest reports and you know more or less what to expect, what style of reporting they have, what type of stuff they tend to find, right? So having public Pentest reports would be a good one. Then another one would be, are they leaving you in the dark during the test, giving you the report at the end and then saying bye? Or are they like reporting things during the test, right? So, for example, we always have like a shared Slack channel or similar with a customer or a Google chat. It depends on the customer, right? So sometimes it's Element, but it doesn't matter. Like some form of a chat system or Signal chat where our team is like actively working with the customer, right? And we find something and we report it to the customer. So this is critical, right? Because sometimes, for example, we found like an extremely cool payment bypass for against like the Stripe implementation the customer had, and we report it as critical during the test, right before the report and everything, just an interim finding during the test, and then the customer tells us, "This is a really cool attack, but it will never work in production because in production we have this flag enabled, so it would not work," right? So this lowered from critical to info, right? But we only know this just because the customer tells us, right? Because we are testing on staging, so we have no way to know, right? In staging, the attack worked. And then we report another thing to another customer and we ranked it medium. And then the customer tells us, no, this is actually critical because nobody should be able to see that, right? In my business, I don't want anybody to be able to see that. This is critical, right? So this type of feedback you only get if you report things during the test, right? So it's very important to have this sort of interaction, as well as free fix verification and quality guarantee, right? So we have all of that, right? So we do the pen test, we report findings during the test, then we send the report, then we wait for the customer to fix, and then we verify the fixes when the customer manages to fix them for free, right? So this is like part of the package in the way we work. So we don't leave the customer just with a report and buy. We say, when you're ready, tell us, and we will retest what we found in the report for free and tell you, okay, these fixes are good, or actually this fix can still be bypassed here, right? So I think that's important too. Yeah, so those would be the main things, right? Having public Pentest reports, then having some sort of free fix verification or fix verification at least, and have this sort of interaction during the test. Like, they are not leaving you in the dark, not telling you anything for a month, and then sending you an email with a report or something like that, right? So you want to have this interaction, these interim findings where you can give feedback, and then the fix verification at the end, right? Just to make sure everything is good to go in production. So those would be some of the most important things that come to mind. And then another red flags would be if you give the source code, but in the report there's like nothing about the source code, there's like no affected code or anything, then it looks like they tested black box. Or if they don't ask you, if there's an API and they don't ask you for the API documentation, this would be another red flag, because without the API documentation, you are never going to test an API properly 90% of the time. So those would be some of the red flags. Or if they tell you like the Pentest is very cheap, you should be suspicious as well, because that means they are going to paste it from some automated tool, or they are going to pay people like really badly because they are just fresh out of university or something. So these are some of the red flags.
Okay, that's are good points, and thank you for a very interesting topic and lecture, Abraham. Thank you very much for that. I think there's a lot of insight that each and everyone can take from here.